You know, I always thought we should teach ecology outside, in the actual environment, but it's almost impossible to take 150 students out every year. So now that you're learning virtually at home and I'm teaching you online, I can actually make this happen. I can teach you ecology from outside here in the environment. So let's get started. If you break the word ecology down into its roots, eco means home and ology means the study of. So ecology is the study of home. In particular, it's the study of organisms, living things' homes. And you look at not only where they live, but also how they interact with each other and the non-living things in their environment. In ecology, we study ecosystems. Ecosystems are large environments where living things live, where they interact, where they get everything they need. So for example, this forest ecosystem, where I'm standing right now, a large area where all the organisms that live here can get what they need and interact with each other. If we break that word ecosystem down into its parts, like eco meaning home, if you remember from ecology, eco means home. System, so this is a system of homes. And when you take this large area of this forest ecosystem and you break it down into the individual homes of the different organisms that live here, that's when you have your ecosystem. So there are many individual homes within this ecosystem. Each home of an individual organism is called a habitat. So a habitat is the exact place or exact location where the living thing gets everything that it needs to survive. So the organism can get all the stuff that it needs. That's called its habitat. So there might be many habitats within this one ecosystem. Let's look for an example of a habitat here in this forest ecosystem. So here's an example of a habitat here in this forest ecosystem. Here we have some moss growing, and this moss is the habitat for the moss, where it gets everything that it needs is this one rock, because it gets sunlight. It's a non-vascular plant, so it gets sunlight, it gets some water when it rains, and it also gets some nutrients because there's actually these lichen are here, and they're breaking down the rock as well. So this moss can get some nutrients from the lichen. So this rock actually is the entire habitat for this moss here. So this one living thing, this moss, this non-vascular plant, actually gets everything it needs just from this rock. So the rock itself is its habitat, but it's part of the bigger forest ecosystem. So the moss, a non-vascular plant, as well as all the other plants, including the trees that are all around me, they live in a certain specific location within the forest ecosystem. So they have a smaller habitat. But what about the animals that can move? Clearly, I've seen them here, though not today, unfortunately, can't get a video of them. There are deer here. There's also a turkey that walks around. What about the deer? What about the turkey or the fox that live here in this forest ecosystem? Where's their habitat? So their habitat is going to be larger than the moss and the other plants that are around here, because they're going to take up everywhere they go. Their habitat is going to encompass everywhere they go to get what they need. So where they get their food, where they get their shelter, where they get their water, whatever else it is that they need. That's the entire place that they do that, is their habitat within this forest ecosystem. Speaking of habitat, look at this. This is part of a woodpecker's habitat within this forest ecosystem. And because the woodpecker is hollowing out this tree, making holes into the tree, other organisms can take advantage of that and build homes inside, perhaps. That's just an example of how organisms would interact and rely on each other here in this ecosystem. This dead tree and the work of the woodpecker could provide homes for different animals, maybe other birds, insects. There are lots of factors that play into an ecosystem that all come together to make the ecosystem successful. There are living factors like the animals, the plants, the bacteria, the fungi, the other organisms that live here in the ecosystem. Those living factors are called biotic factors. The prefix bio means life. So biotic factors are the factors that are living. So any of the animals, plants, fungi, bacteria. Then there are non-living factors in an ecosystem. Non-living factors like the water that might be in an ecosystem, the rocks, the soil, the light that's coming into the ecosystem, even the air, the carbon dioxide, the oxygen. Those things are all abiotic factors. They're non-living. Putting the A in front of bio means not living. So we have not living factors. Those abiotic and biotic factors come together and all interact to make this ecosystem, or any ecosystem, successful. So ecosystems are large areas that allow organisms to interact and survive here. But it can be broken down even smaller, it can be made bigger. So if you take an ecosystem and you make it bigger on a more global scale, you have something called a biome. So this in particular is a forest ecosystem, and it's actually a deciduous forest ecosystem. And so if I was to look at deciduous forest ecosystems on a larger scale, we would call that the deciduous forest biome, a larger area. So the deciduous forest here where I am, but also elsewhere in a country and around the world. So deciduous forest biome would be just all of the areas that are like this, but across the globe. You can make it even bigger than that. We can talk about all of the biomes together. We call that the biosphere. The biosphere is the part of Earth that is living. So it's where all the living things exist on Earth. That's called the biosphere. The ecosystem, as we already talked about, is all the biotic and abiotic factors together. All the biotic living factors, all the living things, and abiotic factors, all the non-living things like soil, water, sunlight, temperature, so forth. Right? That's the ecosystem. If I break that down to a smaller level and study a little bit more specific, I could have a community. A community would be looking at just the living things that live here. So all of the different trees that live here, all of the different animals that live here, the deer, the turkey, the fox, the birds that live here, as well as the trees and the other plants that live here, including that moss that we saw. If I break that down even more specific, I have what's known as a population. I'm going to look at just one type of living thing and all of the living things of that type that live here. So we have some moss population, right? We saw the one on the rock. There's also other moss here in this forest ecosystem. Let's take a look. All of the moss, all of that one type of living thing is the population of the moss here in this forest ecosystem. I can look at the deer population, I can look at the fox population, I can look at the turkey population, I can look at the maple tree population. I can take one specific type of living thing and look at all the examples of that living thing that live here in this ecosystem. That is a population. So working it back up to the bigger scale, taking populations and putting them together and looking at all the populations, all the different living things that live here, that's called a community. If you add in the non-living things, like the water, the soil, all those abiotic factors, that's when it's called an ecosystem. And if you take the ecosystem and you put it on a global scale, like the deciduous forest across the globe, that's called a biome. And if you take those biomes and you put them all together, you get what's known as the biosphere, or all of the area on Earth where living things exist.